Thanks for sharing your story. Definitely, it's interesting because you bump into this opportunity also by chance, seeing how Google does the internal tooling for developers. You mentioned a lot of times about developers' productivity. Maybe let's start by the definition. What do you mean by developers' productivity? Because these days, there are so many things about productivity, right? Everyone is into productivity, like your to-do list, your calendar, whatever apps that you use. What do you mean exactly by developers' productivity? Is it any different than any kind of productivity out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Developer productivity is a notoriously difficult thing to define. So I will try to come at it from maybe a couple different angles and see if that can help hone in on roughly what it means. First off, I just want to say developer productivity is not lines of code written, it's not number of commits. It's kind of irreducible to any sort of low level metric like that. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, what we do as developers is we're really creating new technology. Every single feature or product that we work on is this new thing. It's never existed before. Our job is to build a program that solves that new problem in a new way. It's almost like a mini R&D project rather than a factory model where you're just like churning out widgets or whatever. Because of that property, you can't really break it down until, okay, this is just the sum of all the functions and classes and files that you author. It really has to do with the ultimate problem you're solving and the users that you're solving it for. So that's one angle. It's not lines of code. It's not like any sort of low-level metric. Organizations that end up treating that as a proxy, even like a first-order proxy, I think end up introducing perverse incentives into their development teams. That's how you get a lot of code written, but not actually solving user problems. The other kind of angle to look at this is just view it in terms of the overall picture. In some sense, every piece of software is worth some amount of time saved or money, because time is money in a certain sense. So if you look at the value that you're creating, one thing that you can look at is how much is this piece of software being used by users, who's using it, and how much are they paying you, or how much revenue are you generating from this piece of software? Because that gives you, I think, a better proxy for how much productivity you're generating. Because at the end of the day, software is all about solving and automating problems for people, saving people time, having the computer do something so that a human being doesn't have to do this rote and repetitive process. And so if you want to measure productivity at a high level, you start with the end user. Think about time saved or money saved through the use of your software. Now, that's the high level principled way of looking at it. How does that actually help you if you're an engineering manager or a programmer on a development team inside a large organization? The connection between your individual work or your team's work to the overall revenue of the company or the time saved across all the users of the product is often a hard line to draw. And that's why you get things like the product organization coming up with points, like sprint points. If you use Scrum or Agile or one of those processes, one of the responsibilities of the product organization is to roughly map user value, time saved, whatever matters to the company and to the customers to this point system that reduces all those complex factors and their interrelationships between different teams to this rough point allocation that's easy for engineering teams to reason about. And so then you're talking about how many points are you doing in a given quarter or so. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's roughly how productivity is measured organizationally. But I think at an individual level, it's almost like this feeling. It's almost like this binary thing. As a developer, you either feel productive, you don't feel productive. If you've done any amount of software engineering, you know that feeling. The difference between being in this flow state where your brain feels like it's firing on all cylinders, you have all the contextual information you need and you're just coding away and you're like, holy crap, I'm getting a lot done. Versus the other feeling, which is when you're like, I don't actually know how this piece of code that I'm contributing to works. So all the changes I make are like too local, or I keep breaking things, or I keep having to ask this other person a bunch of questions, or the iteration cycle is too long for me to get feedback, to get into that kind of flow state. So at an individual level, I think it often reduces to just which mode are you in? Are you in kind of paralysis mode, or are you in getting stuff done, shipping code mode?
I like the way that you explain that at the end of the day, it has to bring value either to your users or brings revenue to your company. But obviously, this is a very tough thing to define, because how do you actually map back what you do as a developer? Like churning code, maybe debugging, testing, and map that back into how you bring values to the users. And I think it's taken for granted in many companies that they don't actually do this kind of measurement. I know when you say for individual, we know it when we feel it. There will be a day when you feel like, oh, you're on fire, you're getting a lot of things done, your code just works pretty fine. But there are days where you are drudging through maybe processes, maybe, I don't know, like very difficult bugs to solve, or even competing priorities between multiple tasks that you need to do. But in the first place, because in many companies, I'm sure that there's no such thing as a good, well-defined developers' productivity metrics or measurement. But do you think that we should start measuring and investing our time in coming up with these developers' productivity numbers, metrics, or even like some kind of rough proxy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is important to measure things and to quantify them because I think numbers keep people honest. Obviously, they're never going to capture everything that you care about, but in order to have something falsifiable and checkable, it's good to define a metric and then track your progress toward it. Because if you just define things in terms of qualitatively, it's very easy to trick yourself and other people into thinking that, oh, you actually hit that, where maybe you didn't actually deliver on what you were trying to deliver on. So metrics and quantifying things is important, but it's really important what metric you choose and how you quantify that. Right now, I don't know if there is like a single universal metric of developer productivity that it makes sense to adopt across every software organization, because I think whatever metrics that you use are in some sense tied to your unique organization and in some sense tied to the problem that you're solving or the type of software that you're building. So the way I think about it is if you're a single developer working on a solo project that's completely self-contained, let's say you're an indie developer, you're going to build a simple tool and then you're going to sell that for money. Your metric, the one that matters, is really revenue. How much money are you generating? How much are users willing to pay for this piece of software? Because that tells you how useful this piece of software is to them in some sense, or it's at least a lower bound on how useful this thing is to them. And you scale that up to 100-person org or 1,000-person org. At the top of your product engineering organization, there's a person, maybe their title is VP, maybe the title is CTO, maybe it's director, who is responsible for delivery of the whole system and is in some sense responsible for ensuring that system is delivering as much value as it can to its users, whether it's measured by revenue that product generates or time spent using the product. Whatever it is, they probably have one or two metrics that really are the KPI, or key performance indicator of how well they're doing their job. When they report to the CEO, when they report to the board, that's how they're evaluated, at least in most well-run software companies. It's that person's job to then go break it down, like the people reporting to them, okay, what do I need them to do in order to achieve this goal? In some cases, they might be able to break it down such that, okay, this part of the product is very independent from this other part of the product. So I'm going to have two reports of mine. You're responsible for this one and you're responsible for that one. And I'm going to look at the engagement numbers of each separately. And I'm going to tie your compensation to those metrics because that's a really good proxy of the overall usefulness of each part of the system. Now, that's the lucky case. If you can take apart the things and it breaks down nicely without interdependencies. I think more commonly is that there's a lot of interdependencies. You can't really say that you can't evaluate any piece of an end user software application in isolation without reasoning about its impact on other parts. And there's also cross-cutting concerns such as technical debt, test coverage, and things like that you have to worry about, like the overall health of your team. And at the end of the day, it really is that person's responsibility to figure out how this all breaks down. Yeah, I unfortunately don't have a satisfying answer here because I think every organization is a little different. It starts from the top. That person has a number that they're trying to optimize that is a proxy for the overall end user value that they're trying to deliver. And then part of the art and craft of building an organization is figuring out what the right breakdown of responsibility is and what metrics are going to be used to evaluate how each constituent part of that organization is working.